Hello and welcome to Unacademy, one-stop destination for civil services aspirants. Welcome to this special session where we are going to carry out a detailed discussion of the essay paper for the mains examination which occurred today. And in this particular session, the aim shall be to understand how could we write an essay. What should be the point of thinking when it comes to writing an essay for UPSC? What should be the approach? And what could be the pointers which could have been included in the various different questions associated? Now, in this particular session, we are going to discuss all the 8 topics of essay paper in detail and try to gauge an idea about how we could diversify our essay writing. And for those of you who are going to appear for the examination next year or the year after that, you can also gauge an idea about how to frame your thoughts in a particular order and how to diversify your essay in terms of the horizontal and the vertical expansion. What that is? So let us understand that. First of all, when we talk about the essay writing, for the past few years, you have basically observed, or you would have observed this, that the essays now are mostly oriented towards philosophical topics. So the philosophical topics, regardless of the reservations which are expressed, now these philosophical topics, they give you a greater scope, right, in order to paint a wider canvas, in order to express your thoughts. You are not restricted in terms of, let's suppose you have to talk only about health parameters, you have to talk only about the educational parameters, and so on. So that is why, first of all, this is advantageous. And when it comes to the quality of the questions, now overall the question was comparatively easier as compared to the last year. If you would have had done your prior homework of going through the PYQs in essay, now many of the topics, even though the wordings have changed, but the implications and the perspectives needed to be brought to the table are absolutely similar. So you will find certain keywords being repeated in this year's essay paper, which makes it easier for the candidates as well. Now, as we will discuss the topic, one thing that you have to understand, that for every essay, how to expand or how to write an essay. Understand that writing an essay for, let's suppose, 300 words, it becomes easy if you are able to decipher the question. But to write an essay for around 1200 words, you do need to provide various perspectives and make it relevant in the present context. So that does involve vertical expansion of the topic, vertical expansion, as well as the horizontal expansion of the topic. What do we mean by that? So, when we say vertical and the horizontal expansion, it literally means expanding the ideas which need to be expressed. For example, let's suppose any topic is considered or given to you. First thing that you have to understand is whether that topic is applicable at a personal level, at a personal self. Then, from that, is it applicable at a level of a family or at a level of a society? Then you move furthermore, and whether that topic is applicable at the level of a nation state as well. So that is known as the vertical expansion: personal, that is self, society or family, and then eventually the nation. And when we talk about, or the world as well, then when we talk about the horizontal expansion, that means for any particular topic, are we able to provide the historical connotations, the geographical environmental connotations, the aspect about international relations, diplomacy, governance, political structures, economic outcomes, and even the ethical dilemma and morality issues which can be linked with that topic. That also gives you the scope to provide certain examples and make it relevant for the modern world context. Now, overall, the pattern is that you have 4 questions in section A and 4 questions in section B, 4 topics in section A, and also 4 topics in section B. Out of these, for section A, you had to write one essay out of these 4 topics, and even in section B, you had to write one essay out of it. So here you will find these 4 topics. So in section A, you have truth knows no color. Again, an abstract philosophical topic, but then this shares its keyword of truth from the previous topics. For example, you had the previous year questions talking about wisdom finds truth. Now, the essay required for this particular topic is quite similar to that. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting, and so on. You also had the topics associated with section B. One by one, let us pick up these topics and let us analyze what could have been written and how could we have brainstormed the ideas to arrive at an essay, starting with section A. Now, first of all, coming to the first question, truth knows no color. Now, here, the first thing that you have to do when you are confronted with any essay topic is identification of the keywords. So, which are the keywords in this particular topic? So, you basically have two keywords which are highlighted. One is truth, another is the aspect of color. Now, here, color does not only restrict itself to the absolute meaning of, let's suppose, the racial bias or the aspect of the truth being prejudiced. It has to be understood in the era of the modern post truth world, where basically the perspectives in which any particular piece of information is received, that also appears to be prejudiced, that also appears to be painted with certain hues. So that is the keyword that you have to express. Now, when you are writing an essay for this particular topic, the key questions which need to be addressed, first of all, prior to providing the different perspectives. So, here, what do we understand by the aspect of truth? Is truth absolute? Or is truth a mere interpretation of fact from one individual to another, from one timeline to another? Is it the case that the truth or the reality which existed 100 years back has that truth changed today? Or do the fundamentals of truth remain the same? So, what is the aspect of truth? That needs to be explored. And then, despite receiving the same piece of information, why is it that everybody has got different interpretations of that information? Right. So truth appears to be biased. If, let's suppose, there is a cyclone warning and the cyclone doesn't come, now that can be taken as a case of a false warning, that can be taken as a case of weather anomaly as well. Let's suppose somebody does an act which is harsh on you. Now, is that the compulsion of the other individual or is that out of animosity towards you? So that is why when we talk about a truth of an individual, it can differ from one individual to another in terms of how it is perceived. Now, the perception is something which can be a reason for prejudice. How do we receive a set of information? Why do we have the truth which can be prejudiced? And in the era of post truth world, how important it is to basically understand the basic realities of life, social equality, when we talk about inclusivity. So that is some of the ideals of truth which has to be held together. And also making it relevant in terms of the current situation which we see across the globe. The impact of truth. The truth has the power to change the world. And as the Supreme Court judgments have also observed, that sunlight is the best decontamination. So the truth shines the way towards better future perspectives. Now, the perspectives which could be provided can be historical, societal, political, the aspect of governance in terms of diplomatic relations across the world, and even in terms of the climate justice and climate fight. So, those are the perspectives that you can bring to the table. But along with that, simultaneously, you also have to give some scope for the counter perspective or a counter narrative, whereby you can have the scope to express that yes, truth does know color. Someone's truth can be different from other individuals' truth. So here, that is the key word or that is the key framework across which the essay can be framed. Now, let us understand that in greater detail. Now, when you provide the introduction, always ideal to provide a historical anecdote with the introduction. That provides a flow for your essay paper. And always keep one thing in mind. Oftentimes, it happens that when we are taking a look at a particular topic, we get very short sighted in terms of what to write, what not to write, which topics to bring into the examples, and so on. So, whenever you face that dilemma in your mind, keep one key thing in and key solution in your mind. The role of perspectives can be understood by simplifying your syllabus for GS paper 1 to GS paper 4. That means in GS paper 1, which are the subjects that you have? You basically have history, geography, society. In GS paper 2, you have the case of international relations, polity, governance, social justice. In GS paper 3, you have economy, environment, science, and tech. In GS paper 4, you have ethics. Just list them out somewhere. And all for all of these topics, just inspect that whether the particular topic stands the historical aspect of it, or does that give a geographical connotation, and so on. So, the truth is absolute, impartial, and beyond sensory divisions like color, caste, race, gender, and so on. So the idea of truth, because initial part of the essay, you have to align with the topic. You can align with the topic. And that is where you have to say that no, truth knows no color. It is absolute. And today's truth will stand the test of time 100 years later as well, as long as we are sure what is the truth today. So that is where awareness at the level of the self, awareness at the level of the society, and awareness at the level of the globe and the nation becomes very important. You can provide certain anecdotal stories as well in order to substantiate your introduction part. So here, the anecdotes can be provided from Buddha's life. Now, Buddha, basically, when he sought the aspect or the life of enlightenment. Now, Buddha's search for enlightenment and the story around Buddhism and the genesis of Buddhism can be used as an anecdote in majority of these essay topics. So Buddha, then Ashoka's Dhamma, these are some of the anecdotal stories. Mahatma Gandhi's struggle during freedom, independence movement. Now, those are some of the stories that you can keep a track of, that you can simply put in application in various different topics. So, Buddha's search for truth. Now, here, Gautam Buddha was basically born in a privileged society. Now, it was after when he started finding his, and when he had that curiosity, that what is the truth of life? What is the end of suffering in life? That is when he started spreading the message of Buddhism, whereby the aspect of moderation was also propagated. Now, that aspect of moderation applied to everyone, regardless of the faith, regardless of the gender, it applied to everyone. And that is where it provided a path of salvation for almost the entirety of the society. Now, Buddha's path for salvation was not restricted based upon the upper caste or the lower caste, the mercantile caste or classes, or let's suppose only for the male population, only for the patriarchal, and so on. It was for everyone. So the truth of salvation and the truth for life that Buddha propagated was actually for everyone, did not know any foundations, did not know any divisions, did not fall for any color. Now, another anecdote that you can also write is the case of Akbar. Akbar's quest to find the truth behind every religion. Now, this is something that you would have read in the portion of your medieval history where you would have studied about it, that Akbar used to spend a larger amount of time in his Ibadat Khana. And he would basically summon the various different individuals and, in fact, the priests and also the various different informed individuals of different religions. And they had a kind of a healthy debate regarding what is it that religions they seek eventually. Now, this was Akbar's entire plight to find the truth. And that is where came the genesis of Sulhi-Kul. So, Ibadat Khana and Sulhi-Kul in the Middle Ages, they become a beacon for finding truth and spreading that idea of truth for the larger masses, which was against the prominent organized religions which were going around at that point of time. Not against, but divergent from those views. Now, here, Mahatma Gandhi had famously said, truth always triumphs. So, that is a quotation that can be used in order to enhance your writing as well. Now, his struggles in South Africa. Now, when Mahatma Gandhi, prior to coming to India, was undergoing or carrying out his satyagraha in South Africa, at that point of time, he fought for the masses. Now, against the various different racial discrimination which was carried out by the British in South Africa. Now, his fight was not against people of only certain origin. His fight was for the larger masses prevalent as well. When he came to India, and he basically conceptualized the idea of satyagraha. Now, that idea of satyagraha, was it limited to a particular region? Was it limited to a particular gender? Was it limited to a particular race? No. That idea of satyagraha came to be implemented in various different areas, applied in various different areas. So that is where Mahatma's idea of satyagraha was also the idea of truth, finding the truth. That is why prior to launching any of the movements, basically, be it the case of the Champaran Satyagraha, the Bardoli Satyagraha, in any of the cases of the Satyagraha, you will observe that Mahatma Gandhi actually deputed the local leaders and formed a kind of so-called the truth finding commission. It was not officially a commission, but that committee was formed within the Congress, and they would go to the ground, understand the ground realities. Only then, when he was absolutely convinced that the cause is justifiable, would he launch his mass movement. So, there, the importance of finding truth and the idea that this truth is not prejudiced and this truth is based on ground realities. So, that is the case of Mahatma Gandhi, which can also be used as anecdotal story if you are more well versed with that. Whichever portion you are more well versed with, use that as an anecdote. Then, Martin Luther King, his fight for racial injustice. He said, and he famously quoted, lack of or injustice happening anywhere is the lack of justice everywhere. Now, when he talked about, now look at it, he was fighting against racial discrimination and the realities which were prevalent in much of the Western world, particularly in the region of US. But at that point of time, he was seeking for global justice, an end to global apartheid movements as well. So that is where he basically talked about the prominence of truth of racial equality. So this is a direct implication or a direct interpretation of the topic at hand as well. Now, other than that, you can bring along environmental perspectives. For example, you have various different narratives going around that climate change is a hoax. The present day US president does actively believe in the fact that climate change is a part of a larger conspiracy, and that is why you will see that US keeps on withdrawing from the Paris Agreement time and time again. Now, when we talk about the aspect of climate change, it is not a narrative, it is not a perspective of someone's. Various different IPCC reports and the various different scientific findings by World Meteorological Organization or United Nations Environment Program, all the various reports that are brought out, all of them indicate to the same reality, and that is the globe and the world is warming at an exceedingly fast rate. The world is going through the phase of the sixth mass extinction. Sixth mass extinction, isn't it? Now, that means larger number of species are dying day after day. And climate change is a reality. For that, we don't need to look anywhere. We basically have to take a look within our country itself, where the incidences of, let's suppose, drought cycles, floods, cloud bursts, all of them, they have become more prominent. Cyclones, they have become more frequent as well as much more intense in nature. So that again is the case of fighting the narratives pertaining to the climate change, where the reality is that world is changing. Now, the concept of climate justice. This is again one area of divide across the globe. Now, when we talk about climate justice, what is climate justice? It is a fact about the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, whereby the developed nations who have developed on the back of exploiting the nature, carrying out deforestation, emission of greenhouse gases and pollutants into the atmosphere, they owe a greater responsibility in the fight against climate change. And they are supposed to provide financial assistance to the weaker nations in order to help adapt themselves in the changing climate, in the changing environment, and mitigate the disasters as well. Now, the developed nations of the world, they basically are reluctant to provide the funds. and that is the modern era conflict in the realm of climate change. So, there one has to understand that when we talk about the climate justice, developed nations, they do owe the world a responsibility to help save the world because their economic prosperity today is based on the back of the climatic exploitation and the global exploitation that they have carried out for centuries post industrial revolution. In fact, the entire growth of the western world has been on the base of the burning of the fossil fuels. So if today they are unable to provide the modern day technology once they have reached that economic prosperity, how do they expect countries like Nigeria, countries like India to stop burning fossil fuels all of a sudden? So the truth of the matter is that what they have reached, where they have reached, is on the back of exploitation, and hence a greater duty is owed. Now, here you can also quote the previous or the ex Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki moon, who said, there is no plan B because there is no planet B, which talks about the importance of environmental conservation. So, that is the aspect of truth, which will stand the test of time today, 50 years down the line. It stood the test of time even 50 years ago. So that is a truth which is absolute, regardless of the nation. It is not as if climate change becomes different when you are in China and the climate change becomes different if you are in Canada. It is a reality across all races, all castes, and across the entire planet. Other than that, you can also bring some of the political perspectives. Now, when we talk about the present day times, and this is where you can bring contemporary ideas. Now, environmental perspective is also a contemporary idea. In terms of political perspectives, we can bring to the table the fact that in the modern day times, we find multiple debates raging, particularly around social media and popular culture, about the drawbacks of democracy. That whether democratic regimes are better, or would we be better resorting to authoritarianism. But here also, one has to understand that the only form of inclusive governance that can be provided is a democratic governance. It has got its drawbacks. Democracy is chaotic, but that is the only way in which you can take everyone together, in which the voice of minorities are actually heard. Now, minority does not only restrict itself to the religious aspect, minority in terms of gender, vulnerable, the transgender population, then even in the case of race, ethnicity, linguistic minority, everyone is included in that. Now, it is only in democratic regimes when the development and inclusion of everybody can be carried out. So that is the truth. That is the truth in terms of the way of governance. So that should be the value which should be carried ahead. Now, when we talk about, let's suppose the case of even the constitutional and the framing of Indian constitution. Now, at that point of time, universal adult franchise was provided. Now, India was not very literate and the literacy rates were very low. But still, when the first elections were conducted, India ensured that everybody gets a right to vote. When we talk about the Western democracies, who pride themselves as being much older democracies than India, they took centuries to arrive at the stage of universal adult franchise. But we were there from the first day and from the first election. Because we realized and we have that understanding that the truth of the matter is that government is, in fact, for the people and by the people. So that is where you cannot eliminate someone, exclude someone when it comes to the matter of governance. This is where you can bring about the ideas of even Antyodaya or Gandhiji's talisman, any of those. Okay, that can also be integrated in this particular portion. Then you also have the case of constitutional morality. Now, for example, when we take a look at the political journey of post independent India, we observe that there have been multiple attempts to change the constitutional framework. 42nd Amendment, Constitutional Amendment, was notorious to bring about large number of changes. Prior to that as well, you had consistent tussle between the Supreme Court and the government of the day. But the reality, which was indicated by the Kesavananda Bharati case, was very clear that there is a basic structure of the constitution. And that basic structure of the constitution basically ascribes to the truth of the day in terms of the rights of the individual and the duties of the welfare state that India is supposed to be. So, any change that you bring about the constitution, the lengthiest constitution, written constitution out there, any change that you want to bring, you bring as long as it ascribes to the basic truth. And that is the basic structure. So, this is where, in terms of constitutional morality, you can bring about the basic structure doctrine of the Supreme Court. And that is where Kesavananda Bharati case can be cited. Okay. Other than this, you can also bring contemporary judgments. For example, you can bring judgments in terms of when we talk about triple talaq, when we talk about, let's suppose, the case of Sabarimala judgment. In all of those, you will find that the truth of equality, gender parity, that prevails and that stands true throughout the country and through various different regions and religions. So these judgments of the Supreme Court could also be added with one or two sentences explaining it, and that would have added authenticity to your essay. So that is something that you should basically vouch for, or that is something you should aim for. Then, in terms of international relations and international diplomacy, truth knows no color. So, famously, as it is said, it is not the era of wars, but sadly, we are living in an era of war where you have more than 50 conflicts which are raging across the globe, regardless of what the president of United States claims. The reality is that many of these conflicts have been raging for some time now. Now, in this era of war, the truth is that it has triggered a real refugee crisis. Earlier, it was seen in Ukraine in 2022. Prior to that, it was seen and observed in the region of Syria. And even today, you have large number of refugees who want to and who are fleeing the region of the war-torn Gaza. And they are hounded. Many of them, they don't get entry in various different countries as well. There is also the reality that these wars should not only be taken a look at a national level, even civil wars. For example, what happened with the Rohingyas in the region of Myanmar? The truth of the matter was that they required shelter. It did not matter the religion or the nationality that they originate from. Shelter was must. Help was a must. And that is where the refugee crisis could be talked about. Now, the new pattern of conflict which is observed across the globe. Countries like resorting to conflict in order to assuage their own domestic population as well, something that we are seeing in the case of Israel. We have seen that basically when we talk about, let's suppose, Benjamin Netanyahu's government. Now, Netanyahu's government is losing and has lost popularity in the domestic audience. And that is where the war with Gaza and the war with the region of Israel that has been raging on for more than years now. So, that conflict resolution, which was the role of the global governance, that has completely disappeared from the world. And that is the truth. Regardless of the claims of mediation, the reality is that this truth is that conflicts are no longer being resolved, they result in kinetic actions. Now, that also indicates the vital role to be played in multilateralism. That how multilateralism, that the global good should be basically made a point of concern. Now we have learned our lessons from the case of the bloc politics of the Cold War. So that is why rise of multilateralism is also something which helps the larger global good, and that is also the truth, which knows no nation, no color, no race, no boundary. Now, vaccine diplomacy, which was basically launched by India during the time of the COVID pandemic. Now, there also, we could have adopted a reality or a pathway, just like, let's suppose, the US adopted. And the Western countries, they started hoarding the vaccines for themselves. But then, what happened eventually? India realized that COVID does not know or does not discriminate based upon nation, region, religion, caste, ethnicity. COVID impacts everyone. Population which is poor, who cannot afford the vaccines, they cannot be left to die. So, what was the truth here? Respect for human lives and humanity. So, that is where vaccine diplomacy by India during COVID, right, that is vital. That can be a perspective which can be added. Okay. Now, when you talk about, let's suppose I have a question by Pinku, that can we use the point of hiding the truths by political parties in the curtains of bills and remedies? No. So basically, when you talk about the political parties and their individual behavior, now it will only justify the aspect of truth. It will not justify the aspect of it knows no color. Okay, you can quote the Supreme Court judgment in the case of right to privacy. That is a different matter altogether. But when it comes to political parties, the if you want to bring the perspective of political parties, you can talk about the penchant with democratic ideals. Everybody talks about democratic ideals, but then do they follow it internally as well? So that is where you can talk about it, that democratic ideals, if they stand true for a nation, they should stand true at a micro level for the political parties itself, but not in terms of the curtains of bills and remedies. Right? Now, the economic perspective, when we talk about the era of globalization, we are living in an interconnected world. Still, we are living in a reality where every country is looking inwards. There's a rise of protectionism across the globe. But the reality of the matter is that the global growth rates have grown tremendously ever since the era of globalization took over. Ever since all the countries started trading with each other rather than boycotting each other. So that is the reality, regardless of the tariff wars that Trump wages today, regardless of the protectionism or the dumping which China does, regardless of the inward looking policies of European Union or UK for that matter. Globalization has benefited the world. Even you have multiple voices in India who vouch against or who advocate against globalization, who talk about only the domestic economy. But there again, globalization is better for Indian economy and also for the global economy. So that is the reality. So here you can cite the aspect of the truth in terms of the global growth rates, and that is free of discrimination. That is not biased of discrimination. Okay. Now, here trade protectionism hurts the economy in a longer run. Now, truth regarding economic policies. Now we see various different economic ideals being followed across the globe. Now, from extreme left to extreme right to the centrist policies, all of these different ideals are being tried, and the governments, they basically justify the political actions or the economic actions that they end up taking. But when you judge these decisions, you have to look at the reality on the ground. Inequality on the ground is increasing. And that is where you can also quote the Oxfam report. The Oxfam report, which talked about the rising inequality across the world and also in India, where almost 1% of the population, in many of the cases, they hold almost 99, more than 90% of the wealth of the nation. So that is the truth. It is not the case that people of a particular caste, culture, creed, gender, they are disadvantaged. It is throughout. So when you talk about governance in terms of economic policies, how do you judge that? What is the crucible for that? Now, what could be the counter perspective? The perspective that we have talked about is that truth knows no color. Truth is universal. Truth is time independent. Here you can also talk about in terms of social reformers, by the way. So, social reformers are also something that you could talk about. So, when you talk about, let's suppose, the various social ills, for example, sati, right? Then, when you talk about child marriage, now that was wrong 200 years back, that is wrong today, and that is wrong 100 years in the future as well. Now, that is where the truth remains static, truth remains absolute. The last case of sati in India occurred when? 1987. So while it was wrong in the 1800s, it is wrong today. And surprisingly, we do observe that in the region of US, there is resorting by the Republicans back to the aspect of child marriage again. So that culture needs to be dissuaded, right? Discouraged. So that is where social reformers can be used to indicate the time independent nature of the truth. Okay? Independent nature of truth. So that is basically something that can be highlighted. So, what you have done in this essay, the perspectives that you have provided region specific, that truth is region independent, truth is gender independent, truth is race independent, and also truth is time independent. So, you have proved truth is absolute. But there is also a scope to provide counter narrative. Not many of us are able to think about the counter narrative or the challenges to the topic. So, this is where you have to use the thinking power. Now, here you can quote Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, Friedrich Nietzsche has said that our actions are completely dependent on our past experiences. So, basically, how I perceive a truth will be dependent on my past experience. For example, let's suppose as a community, I have faced a lot of abuse. As a family, as an individual, let's suppose I have faced a lot of abuse. If tomorrow someone extends their helping hand as well, I will take a look at it with suspicion. So the truth for me becomes colored. The truth for me becomes biased. If I have a preconceived notion in my head that this individual is bad, so regardless of what that individual does, I will find some lacunae. So my truth is biased. My truth is prejudiced. So it is not true that truth knows no color. Based upon your lived experience, civilizational values, and the cultural setting, the reality of truth varies from time, also varies in terms of the customary morality, even varies in terms of one region to another. So that is where importance that you have to highlight is importance of lived experience. Okay, that is something you can highlight. And here you can say, for example, lack of exposure in certain cases means that certain individuals they perceive the truth differently. For example, isolated communities, they take a look at infrastructure as a matter of intrusion, whereas infrastructure can also mean development. Infrastructure can also mean destruction, but always it is taken a look with a suspicious eye. So that is where Friedrich Nietzsche can be quoted. And you can talk about the challenges to the narrative. Okay? Now, then after that, moving on to the second question. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. A famous quotation by Sun Tzu. Now, this talks about the role of basic aspects or how do you win a war without indulging in a skirmish or without indulging in a fight. So, the supreme art of war means what? How do you win a war? Art of war cannot mean that how you have valiantly fought in the war and basically were defeated. Art of war here refers to how do you win the war. So, how do you win the war without fighting? Right? So, how do you subdue the enemy? That is where winning the war comes into picture. So, what are the basic aspects that you have to address in this essay? First of all, war is fought. Now, when we say war is fought, are the wars fought only at the borders? When we say war, does that only mean airplanes and the tanks and the cannons? Does that only mean war between, let's suppose, India, Pakistan, India, China, Russia, Ukraine, and so on? No. War can be internal as well. So, this is where vertical expansion of the topic has to be provided. That is what will differentiate your answer from the rest. Mind you, every person who would have written this answer, majority of them, 99% of them, would have only considered the aspect of the war in terms of the nation, in terms of environment, and so on. That is where the personal perspective is very important to be highlighted. Oftentimes, you are in a battle with yourself, the aspect of ethical dilemma, what is correct and what is not to be done. You are offered certain choices in life. You make certain decisions. Some decisions become correct, and eventually some have a backlash. So that is where the internal battles at a personal level. Society undergoing a churn to establish a peaceful coexistence. That is a war within society, trying to bridge the divides within the society. So that is the war at the level of the society. So societal clashes associated. So that is where the war in terms of the vertical aspect needs to be talked about. Now, when we say subdue the enemy, so who is the enemy here? Any adversary. Adversary can be yourself, adversary can be, let's suppose, the government, adversary can be a political grouping, adversary can be any nation, adversary can even be the world at large. So, depending upon the scenario, adversary changes. So, who becomes an adversary? So, when we talk about subduing the enemy, so that also you need to explain. Who is an enemy? An enemy is an individual or an entity who ascribes for a process or a thought or a perspective which is antithetical to our own belief. That is an enemy. That where my thought process comes at risk. That is an enemy. So that is where the adversarial relation in terms of the beliefs, in terms of the values, that becomes the aspect of an enemy. Now, what are the various perspectives and how do you write this essay? So, anecdote here, you can talk about Ashoka's Dhamma. Now, when we talk about Ashoka's Dhamma, you have to understand that basically in the entire aspect or during his entire reign, he fought multiple battles. It was not as if Ashoka was a peaceful king. He fought multiple battles and is said to have killed lakhs of population. But then the historians they agree that Ashoka was able to spread his message much more significantly when he resorted to the aspect of Dhamma, where Ashoka himself admitted that his departure from Bheri to Dhamma would mean a symbolic shift to winning the hearts and the minds of the people. Now that helped increase his clout, that helped increase the tenure of his reign as well. And you had a peaceful empire thereby. So that can be an anecdotal story that you can start just after the case of the Kaling War, right? Now, Arthashastra, here there is also the scope for Indian philosophical aspects. Now, in terms of Arthashastra, what does Kautilya talk about? Sam, Dam, Dand, Bhed. You can write it Sam, Dam, Bhed, Dand. That resort to war as a final eventuality. Before that, try every means which are possible in order to resolve or gain victory. So, whenever you want to gain victory, war can be a last option. So, that is how you can talk about Indian philosophical ideas as well. Now, the path of non-violence, right? Now, take a look at Mahatma Gandhi's entire ideals against the British Empire. Now, that was a mighty British Empire which, at one point of time, ruled almost more than half of the world. But what weapon did Mahatma Gandhi have? Did he wage a famous war like the Battle of Plassey or so on? No. Mahatma Gandhi and, in fact, the entire freedom movement gained victory over the Britishers without fighting them in terms of gaining a victory in terms of morality, gaining a victory without a single shot being fired. Yes, you had the mutiny which happened, the naval mutiny which happened. You had the vital role of the revolutionaries. But then it was not a large scale war where the British army and the Indian army were head to head. But the battle and the war was won. So you subdued the enemy by weakening it from multiple points and from multiple avenues, from ground to level up by principled approach which was adopted. So that can also be the aspect. Now, another very vital perspective that can be brought to the table is the case of the Cold War. Now, we know that post the Second World War, the world indulged in bloc politics, and you had two superpowers, US and the USSR. Now, after the disintegration of USSR, you had the world with the surviving sole superpower, that was the US. Now, US did not wage a direct war with USSR. It was not as if the American armies and the Russian and the Soviet armies were head to head somewhere in Europe and so on. No, the battle and the war was won on multiple fronts. Soft diplomacy, in terms of economic weakening, in terms of their own growth. And that is how, in terms of the model of governance, in terms of, let's suppose, when we talk about entrepreneurship, that is how US eventually managed to win the battle without firing single shot. So that is how it is the victory or the art of war, subduing the enemy without fighting them. Okay, so this is also about weakening the enemy from various other avenues, right? Now, battle against self is something that you have to elaborate, understanding of the conflict that you are going through as an individual in your adolescence, or let's suppose eventually when you talk about as an individual when a young one. Now you go through multiple dilemmas, that whether should I follow the pragmatic approach today, that everybody is taking some bribe, and if I don't take bribe now, will that mean that I am ousted or I am eliminated or excluded from somewhere, or should I stick to the aspect of morality? So, this is your internal battle. This is an ethical dilemma. Now, there, how do you win the war without going into mental depression and the aspect of the self depraving vicious cycle where eventually you are the biggest sufferer? How do you win that battle? That is by informing yourself of the various different outcomes, sticking to the ideological principles that you have, right? So that is how internal battles and wars can be won. When we talk about the aspect of the society, now we are living in an era where society is going through multiple divides and ruptures, and where various different nefarious forces are seeking an opportunity to exploit these divides. Now, in order to seek a long lasting peace, what does a society seek? A society thereby understands the role of mediation. Conflict resolution becomes important. When we talk about the present times, so in terms of the warring factions in a society, rather than coming out and in terms of a situation of social clashes, agitations, and killings, mediation, conversation, that is very valuable. So that is where individual level of society, vertical expansion. So this is something which will add some diversity to your answer from the rest. Now, you can also talk about the principle of prevention is better than cure. After all, the prevention, what do you do when you prevent a disaster? You are subduing an impending enemy. Enemy can be a disease. In this particular case, enemy can be, let's suppose, an enemy nation. Enemy can be a narrative. Enemy can be a propaganda. Enemy can be anything, right? So when we talk about fight against climate change, now, is it the case that when the world is about to end, only then should we start fighting against climate change? No. If you want to win against climate change, if you want to win against global warming, you have to basically get your act together now so that you are not faced with the adversarial situation. And this stands true even in the case of disaster management. When we talk about disaster management, now when a cyclone strikes, is it the case? Now, in that case, that disaster is your enemy. So, in that disaster, how do you recuperate? How do you take charge? Here, basically, what do? Prepare yourself. So, you can defeat that cyclone by taking proper precautions. That is what we do in terms of the disaster management approaches that are followed. Right. So that can also be brought to the table when we talk about, let's suppose, a cloudburst, landslide events, which are very prominent nowadays. So that is your enemy. Nature is your enemy. How do you protect, or how do you win against nature? Do you win against nature by more construction? No. You win against nature with sustainable living. So that is where the role of sustainable living can also be brought to the table. In terms of the diseases, India's fight against the lifestyle diseases, when we talk about diabetes, when we talk about hypertension, when we talk about cardiovascular issues. Now, these are the diseases which are impacting the younger population of our country at an increasing rate. So, this is where we have to understand that if we want to basically utilize our demographic dividend, we have to win the war against these diseases. And how do you do so? By promoting wellness rather than basically going for a kind of a curative uh, uh, or a curative approach for the diseases. Rather than popping pills for diabetes, you go for a better standard of living, right? That is where sports need to be inculcated into the daily curriculum and so on. Then, even when we talk about vaccine development, we are fighting a raging battle against diseases like malaria. Now, that is where prior vaccine development will help us win the war against the diseases without actually going through the deprivations of the war. Because why is the topic focusing on without fighting a war? That means during a war, there are multiple losses which happen. So that is why, if you are able to win without those losses, that is a virtue. That is the art of war. So when you start suffering from those diseases and then you start taking the cure, you have already lost, isn't it? So that is where you basically have to ensure that vaccine development, research and development should be carried out. Here, you can also use the quotation that if wealth is lost, nothing is lost. If health is lost, something is lost. If character is lost, everything is lost. And that can be used at a personal perspective, at a level of the self. The importance of building character so that you are able to fight your internal battles without going through the phase of mental depressions. So, that is something you can talk about. Now, in terms of the international context and diplomacy, hereby, India's response when we talk about war. Now, when we talk about India's war, the first thing that comes to your mind is what? Pakistan. Now, India has been waging, or India basically has kinetic wars which have been imposed on it from Pakistan since 1948, 1948, 1965, 1971, 1999, and latest, you can consider the case of even Operation Sindoor. Now, is kinetic war the only option to win against Pakistan? No. We have shown previously as well, and this goes back decades, where the shaping of global narratives. Now, prior to the 1971 war, the global narratives through our diplomacy was shaped in such a way that the world understood the refugee crisis that India was going through and a kind of a genocidal action which was carried on by the Pakistani army in the region of Bangladesh shaped the global narrative. We have managed to, in a way, tell the world that, look, this is the birthplace of terrorism, that is Pakistan. That in itself is winning a war, where the country can no longer ensure that the world washes away its false propaganda. Then, sanctions and economic penalty. Now, India has used its heft through the various different global groupings like FATF, Financial Action Task Force, etc., to penalize and ensure that the funding for the terrorist activities are reduced. They have not stopped completely, but as compared to earlier, there's a greater international scrutiny on them. Then covert actions can be taken here also. You avoid bloodshed, isn't it? Then information warfare can be carried out. Information warfare in order to indicate the other part of the world as well that, look, these are the generators of terrorism. These are the aggressors. Historically, we have never been the aggressors. So that is where information warfare is a new era of warfare that the world is embracing itself for. Then, economic diplomacy. Now, when we talk about the era of capitalism, the era of capitalism and imperialism was waged on the edge of a sword, where basically who could be the strongest would have maximum influence. Strongest in battles, they could have the maximum influence. In the modern day context, look at China's example. Now, China has ensured that many countries of the global south they sway with the Chinese policies. Why? Through the help of predatory economics. So, economic aspect of increasing the influence and winning over countries without firing a single bullet. So that is where China's Belt and Road Initiative, through the aspect of economic and infrastructure assistance, they have managed to win the battle on the ground. Then India's assistance in the neighborhood. Now, India also, for a long period of time, has tried to, in a way, enhance its relations in the neighborhood, be it South, be it East, and so on. But when India did provide economic assistance to Sri Lanka during the time of the economic crisis, the nation was indebted. And the nation would not forget that. So that is where India's interest would be in Sri Lanka would be best kept now that India has offered economic assistance. So that is where economic assistance to the smaller nations can go a long way in terms of serving our purpose in diplomacy. For that, we are winning over, in many of the cases, our adversaries as well, without fighting a war. And here, take the case of the present day Maldivian dispensation. When you take a look at the present day Maldivian dispensation, they were very much against the political dispensation in India. But then, over a period of time, we managed to ensure that Maldives provides or ascribes proper value to India. On the basis of what? On the basis of our benevolence. So that is again winning a kind of a war. So these are the some of the international context. Then you come to the aspect of hard power. Hard power, nuclear deterrence. Now, India developed nuclear weapons and India has got a no first use policy. Why? So that any other country does not annihilate us, does not take us for granted. Now, this is again winning a war without firing the bullets associated. So that is where nuclear deterrence, the development of a nuclear triad, that becomes important. Then, the economic interdependence. Make your enemy nation, for example, take the case of China and US today. Regardless of the adversarial comments passed by China or US, the economic interdependence is so high in terms of hundreds of billions of dollars that they will not resort to fighting. And that is where, in terms of mass scale of productions, in terms of holding the supply chains, China has almost managed to win the war against the US. It holds the vital supply of critical minerals, and it is not the largest producer of critical minerals. But in the world, it is one of the largest refiners of critical minerals. So that becomes China's weaponry in this case. So without firing a weapon, it is winning the war. Right? Now, so that is why economic dependence through trade, through grants, through aids, that can be considered. And here you can also talk about the role of soft power. Soft power, which soft power talks about popular culture, beliefs, ideas, philosophies, and so on. Movies, songs, all of them, diplomacy, all of them become a part of the soft power. So when we talk about soft power, now this was also done by US against USSR. At that point of time as well, US basically started fanning out propaganda in the region of USSR through this soft power. But even prior to that, you can find its evidences. When you talk about the Russian Revolution, now the Tsarist regime of Russia were overthrown during the Russian Revolution. How? You basically had various authors like Maxim Gorky, Dostoevsky, all of these individuals who would pass the ideas of revolution in the help or with the help of basic literature. So that is again a kind of a soft power. So literature also becomes an important soft power. This is also something that India has vigorously used against our adversary in the Western neighbor and the Western borders. Diplomatic heft and coercion that can be used to win the trade wars, the tariff wars, which are being waged upon us, self reliance, and diversification. So, when there are tariff wars imposed against you, right? Suppose the present day example. Now, would it be the case that India resorts to violence against US? Not only are we not powerful enough to resort to violence against the US, but that has never been our policy. So, what is the way out? Where we can win the war in the sense, how can we win that tariff war? Why is it that US is not imposing the same kind of penalty on China? Because US understands China is very important, India might not be that important. So that is why we need to become self-reliant. We need to ensure we become a vital player in global economy. We become or we reach the forefront of cutting edge research. We are an important part of modern revolution in terms of digital and AI tools which are happening across the world. So that is where self-reliance and diversification, even in terms of the trade partners, that can be our way of negotiation and winning the war which is being waged against us. But then what is the counter perspective here? What can be the counter perspective which can be provided? Think about it for a brief moment. If diplomacy and soft power would always have its way, history would have seen fewer wars happening. India has never, ever been on the side of war. The Prime Minister famously called out Vladimir Putin to say this is not an era of war. He was amongst the only global major leaders who talked about this. But still, when push came to shove during the Pahalgam attack, we waged an offensive against the enemy that is Pakistan. We did have some losses. We went into almost a half war. But then that was required because the other avenues of negotiations, of dialogues, they did not yield the results. And also, as again, Sun Tzu only notes in The Art of War, Sun Tzu notes that power comes from might. So the mightier you are, better off you are in terms of convincing the other nations never to go into war with you, right? So that is why you have to become mighty. If tomorrow, let's suppose Nigeria has a conflict, or let's suppose Iran has a conflict with US won't blink an eye before destroying the entire region of Iran. But then if Iran were to be as powerful, let's suppose, as China, or significantly powerful like, let's suppose, India, would US resort to the same tactics? No. So that is where sometimes might is also important to get your way and get the rightful outcome. That is something which the world deployed during the Second World War. Nazism and fascism were on the rise. Now, did the world manage to win the war against Nazism just by propagating the ideas of virtue and non-violence? No. They had to resort, and you had the Second World War. So that is a counter narrative that you have to also talk about. Okay? Like M.N. Srinivas said, villages are little republic. Yes, correct. Now, then coming on to the third question. Thought finds a world and creates one also. So here, which are the keywords? Identify the keywords first. The keywords here are thought and world. Thought finds a world and creates one also. So, what is a thought? That needs to be explained. And what do we mean by world here? Do we mean the entirety of the globe and the representation of the globe? Or does that mean its own set of followers and believers in that idea, in that thought process? So that is what needs to be explained. After that, you can provide perspective. Thought finds a world and creates one. That means what? If I have any thought, random thought, it will have certain believers in it. And it can create a new world order as well. It has the power to do that, right? So, power of a thought. This is where you can go for the vertical expansion of the topic. That is, shapes character. If you have a meaningful, constructive thought, it can help build a character in oneself. If, let's suppose, you have that thought process, it can instill belief in a society for cohesion, for unition, and it can also provide the nation with a future direction. And that thought can be anything. That thought can be that we are destined for greatness as a nation. That can also be a thought. The thought can also be that we are too divided as a society. That can also be a thought. You will have multiple followers and ascribers to individual cases, but that will provide a future pathway for the nation state to move ahead. So that is where the vertical expansion of the topic can happen. Now, what is the context of the term world? So, world here refers to believers of the thought. Believers of the thought. Okay? Who believes in that thought. Okay? So, that is a world. Is it stagnant? It is fixed? No, it is flexible. Now, this means there is advantage associated. The voiceless can basically make the world hear their opinion now. In the modern era of social media and communication, you can make your voice amplified much beyond proportion. But at the same time, this also means that there's a lot of scope for misinformation. There's a lot of scope for propaganda. There's a lot of scope for creating divides within the nation. So, both sides of the argument you can talk about. And that is where the role of setting the narrative becomes very important in terms of who is the carrier of that thought. If the carrier of that thought themselves are of vicious ideas, then it can never bring prosperity. Okay? So, that is where thought finds a world and creates one as well. Right? Data and technological control have become new weapons of power, new form of colonialism. Uh, yes, that is also correct. Right. Now, the anecdote that you can provide, thought has got its own world and can create its own one. So that is where Buddha's idea of enlightenment or Ashoka's idea of Dhamma, which brought peace in a war torn area. Now, when you go back to around 3rd century BC, 2nd century BC, at that point of time, peace was not the normative behavior. Peace was not the expected lines in a kingdom, in an empire. If you wanted to wage a larger empire, that could be waged through the road of blood. But then that idea of Dhamma was something which was new, and it had its own set of believers, and it created a peaceful century thereafter, which was very rare in those times. Even when we talk about Buddha, now Buddha's teachings and Buddha's path for parinirvan. Now, there also, you basically have the idea was new, the thought was new. Initially, few followers, but that created a new idea of peace that was later on adopted by Ashoka. So, any one of them you can highlight. Don't highlight both of them simultaneously. Okay? Mahatma Gandhi's idea of satyagrah was a novel idea, an idea which was not implicitly or explicitly tried in the freedom struggle anywhere in the world. So that was a novel idea. Initially, that did not have many believers. But then, once people ascribed to that idea of satyagrah, ahimsa, as a consequence of that, that paved the way for peaceful decolonization of India. I'm not talking about the violence during partition, but wherever the colonial masters left, the nations, if you take a look at the nations in Africa, they all resorted to violence and self-destruction, which has been carried out even today. But India resorted to a peaceful development, partly because of our civilizational values, but also partly because the thought created a new world. And that is something which continues to inspire leaders from Nelson Mandela to Barack Obama in the modern day times as well. Now, Victor Hugo can be quoted, that no one can stop an idea whose time has come. So, here, the importance and the power of the thought and how game changing it can be. Okay? Now, vertical expansion of this topic. So, genesis of a thought. How do you generate a thought? How does an individual come at a thought process? It can be based on the lived experience, that is your own personal experience. It can also be the shared civilizational knowledge, right? That your society has suffered from certain aspects, or your society has basically learned certain lessons in the past. Now, that can be the genesis of the thought. Raja Ram Mohan Roy's fight against Sati. Now, that was basically a civilizational as well as a lived experience, where not only did he observe what was happening was wrong, but then that is something he could see in the entire society as well. So, that is what led to the genesis of the thought. Karl Marx's entire idea of whereby he talked about Das Kapital. Now, he talked about the idea of communism. Now, in that case, he had experienced it at a personal level, that you have exploitation by the capitalists, isn't it? So, it is on a personal experience as well that genesis of a thought can happen. Martin Luther King can be quoted, right? The thought of justice, racial equality, isn't it? So, that is basically the genesis of a thought. Now, what is the role of a thought? What role does a thought play in a personal self, or when we talk about the society? So, self preservation, isn't it? It helps you protect yourself against the adversarial conditions at that point of time. It can provide you motivation to move through and endure tough times that you face. If you have the thought that my future will be better, tomorrow will be better than what today is, that thought in itself can basically give you power to sustain. Then, call to action against injustice, against discrimination. So, that is the thought which matters. Social semblance in terms of peace. For example, when we talk about the violence during partition, now Mahatma Gandhi's call for various different communities to live together, that provided in many of the cases, that call by Mahatma Gandhi in itself was vital for the cessation of violence in certain parts, isn't it? Society came together in certain, not everywhere, but in certain parts definitely. So that is a thought, right? Thoughts can lead to revolution as well. That is where scientific revolution and scientific thoughts and matter, that also comes into play. It can also strengthen a national will. The nation gets together and works towards a common goal. So that is the role and the power of the thought process. Now, thoughts can change the world. Here, historically, they have done so. In case of Renaissance in the region of Europe. Now, Europe was again very much steeped in orthodoxy, and you had the dominance of the church, which in many parts of Europe happens to exist even today. But the reason that Europe became developed was on the back of scientific development. Now, why did the scientific development happen? Because of the idea of Renaissance, because of the idea of challenging the existing norms, because of the idea of questioning the existing realities. This was done by thinkers, philosophers, scientists, astronomers, everybody. And what was the thought? Is the reality the only reality existent? So, when we talk about the art of Michelangelo, whereby the sculpture of David in itself marked a significant departure of how you take a look into art, that revolutionized the entire aspect of scientific reform in Europe. And that is where Europe has reached the present day position. Then the social reformers, the thought that they had in terms of not allowing or discouraging child marriage, in terms of allowing and encouraging widow remarriage, in terms of abolishing sati. So sati was a plague that our society suffered from for a very long period of time. Even when we talk about the case of infanticide, female feticide, that still persists in many parts of our society. Patriarchy still exists. But then the thought that the genders can be equal, that there can be matrilineal societies as well. So that thought changed many societies in many parts. Then, when we talk about the constitution makers, now India had been basically colonized for almost 200 years prior to the independence. But then the constitution framers, the framers of the modern Indian constitution, they basically eyed and looked at and thought of an India free from discrimination, free from untouchability. They included the part 3 in the constitution. And that part 3 in the constitution ensures that all of us, regardless of whatever happens, we deserve and we do live with a common basic fundamental right. Right to life has been given value in terms of various Supreme Court judgments. You can also quote the judgments like, for example, the Champakam Dorai Rajan case, where you can talk about that how Supreme Court gives greater values to the fundamental rights. The idea is what? Rights of the citizens are much more valuable than any of the duties that they basically have to do. Right? So that is where the constitution makers and the political angle can be talked about. Idea of democracy is at question today across the world. You had the very famous interaction where Donald Trump talks about the fact that if you have war after 3.5 years, you don't need to hold elections. Now, that is seen as an easy way out. So, the thought of democracy is what? That the government is accountable to the people and the government can be overthrown if it does not do its job. That is a very important thought. And look at how vibrant it has created our country. How diverse country like India can come together in issues of national calamity. That is the idea of democracy and also the upliftment of the poorest. When we talk about, let's suppose, the previous decade and a half, India, as per World Bank, has managed to uplift the largest section of population out of poverty. Now, this is not the first time, this has happened previously as well. But nonetheless, it is that democratic idea where people, once they get tired of a government or when they see a government being ineffective, they simply overthrow it. So, that idea of democracy is a thought. And that has created a world which is much more beautiful than earlier. Then, economic ideas of socialism that has created and changed the world order. When we talk about modern decolonized world, socialism was a go-to principle in many parts of the world. Right? That is social ownership of the factors of production. Now, that aspect of socialism ensured that in those times you did not have concentration of capital. It is a different matter whether inequality has come into play today or not. But that fundamental pillar of socialism was very vital. It had its disadvantages as well, but the advantages outweighed the disadvantages. The idea of capitalism ensured the growth of the nation states like the US, where entrepreneurship would be rewarded at an exorbitant rate. Then, when we talk about the Communist Manifesto, something which was followed to the T by countries like Cambodia. Now, that is what changed those areas. Right? Communist Manifesto, when it was released. Now, that again ensured multiple revolutions in the entirety of the region of Latin America as well, much later, obviously, and in many parts of the Eurasian region as well. Then the idea of globalization is another such idea. It was a thought, but led to global prosperity and global growth as well. Now, contemporary scenario, the positives of the thoughts being amplified. So, it empowers the voiceless. Where today, just on the basis of a thought, an individual like Malala Yousafzai, now this can also be used in the introductory anecdote, by the way, Malala Yousafzai or Greta Thunberg. Now, Malala Yousafzai, coming from a very rural hinterland area of Pakistan, now she can make her voice heard across the globe. She can basically win a global prize on multiple forum. Nobel Prize included. Why? Based upon the fact that her thought was about female education. She was voiceless, isn't it? But the modern world creates a scenario or gives you a platform where even the voiceless can make their thoughts heard. Right? Now, it can spark a revolution. Here, you can talk about the case of Arab Springs, starting from the region of Tunisia. That can be given as an example. Seeks justice. And here we have seen countless agitations which have been carried out on the streets, even in our country, seeking justice for the poor, for the voiceless. And that is something which can be highlighted. It is something which is amplified or enhanced by the social media. So that is a positive perspective you can bring. Then the anecdotes by Greta Thunberg also you can bring to the table, where a young girl, made her voice heard to the highest of the offices of the world. And that is where the fight against climate became the fight for the common masses as well. Earlier, fight against climate was restricted to the upper echelons of the society, the upper areas of governance. That was truly democratized after. Now, whether Greta Thunberg is correct or not is a different matter for a different debate and a different day. But then her thought created a new world perspective as well. But at the same time, you also can highlight the drawbacks of this, that thoughts have their own world and they can also create one, right? We have environmental protection in our constitution, correct. Now, what can be the thought or the drawbacks associated? Here, basically, you can talk about the easy to change aspect of the public opinion based upon misinformation. Misinformation becomes very common. And that is where public opinion can be swayed. And that is where false narratives and ideas of conspiracy theories are on the rise, where the disillusionment against the social order, disillusionment or the conspiracy theories that certain section of society are out there to have you, that is gaining much more prominence. We are living in an era of clickbait. We are living in an era of false narrative. We are living in an era of misguidance and misleading activities. Propaganda is a norm in the modern day era. Look at US, what is happening in US, and you will get the example. Now that is where this thought is gaining such popularity and so quickly. You need a counter narrative, or at least you need sane voices. Then we saw that even vicious ideas like Nazism and fascism, now these were also thoughts, but then it became very popular. It became very, very popular. Now, thereby, it was a thought. It created its own world. It created new nuisance thereafter, but it became popular. And it is also something which gives rise to religious fundamentalism. You have hate attacks, isn't it? So that religious fundamentalism can sometimes give rise and vitiate itself in the form of communal clashes, can vitiate itself in the form of terrorism, and so on. And there is also a further propagation of retrograde ideas. For example, in many parts of the developed world, you will find that abortion is being looked down upon. A woman's right on her own body is being questioned in the 21st century because the thought process linked with religious fundamentalism is gaining prominence. Retrograde ideas of patriarchy, they are becoming very dominant. So that is again a drawback of this. We are living in a post-truth world, very difficult to discern what is true, what is a propaganda, and that is what the common public is falling prey to. Disillusionment against the society, government, or the present norms of the family. So the family structures are at risk. The normal societal behaviors and interrelationships, where the society would be interdependent on each other and peaceful coexistence would be the norm, has been replaced by suspicious movement and an eye of criticism, where the governments, you can be unhappy with the government, but the idea of the governments, that is looked down upon. where suspicion becomes the norm based upon false propaganda, where a false narrative, for example, we saw during the case of Operation Sindoor, where Pakistan heavily deployed a false narrative that we suffered greater losses. And it has managed to convince almost the entirety of the Western media that yes, we did suffer greater losses. But the reality is something completely different. But how that has changed the global understanding of the conflict in South Asia. So that is an important point to note. Now, power of social media can be misutilized and is misutilized, where oftentimes you also have people claiming to be the victims against capitalism, people claiming to be the individuals who are suffering against atrocity just to bring someone else down. So that is personal attacks against the society also that has increased. And this can always be exclusionary. Thoughts can always be exclusionary, that we are separate, we are different, we require special privilege, or the otherization in the society, that they are different, this race is different, this language is different, this particular region is different. That can give rise to subnationalism and separatism. For example, recent times you observe again in the Western world, particularly in UK, Canada, and even in Australia, there is a rise in the propaganda of Khalistan, separatism. Based on what? Based on the ease by which you can spread this vicious idea, a thought process, on the platform of the modern day world. So these are the drawbacks that one has to be basically very careful about. Okay? Yes, you can also say that the disillusionment over the process of elections, that every election is vitiated, every election is wrong, that can also be included. Yes, absolutely, yes. Okay? Now, the counter perspective, is it always true that thoughts can shape the world? Is it always true? It is not. It depends who has the thought, right? The powerful still drive the narrative. So that is where you have to understand it is not always the case that the thought will always have its own world. A thought can be born and die in isolation. Various scientific thoughts can be cited in this. When it comes to, even let's suppose, when we talk about various discoveries by by the case of the various scientists, astronomers in Europe during the Middle Ages. Now, many of them faced persecution by the church. The ideas died, only to be reinvigorated much later on. So, yes, they did manage to create a world order later on, but at that point of time, that thought did die in isolation. Or you can pick the case of even geographical thoughts. Now, even in geographical thought, you have a perspective that people of a certain region, they have certain advantage, biological advantage. And people, let's suppose when we talk about people of Indian origin, they have disadvantage in terms of their physical might. Now, that thought did not have much of its followers. Similarly, there are many vicious ideas and thoughts which are propagated time to time in order to fragment and break a nation. Societal cohesion beats them all. So it is about who has that thought and what is that thought. Is that thought? A thought can die a lonely and an isolated death. Okay? Now, then coming on to the final question of section A, that is, best lessons are learned through bitter experiences. Now, this is about that the learnings tend to happen when you have faced adversary or adversarial conditions. That is when you learn something. Okay, so that is best lessons. It is not only lessons, best lessons. So, which are the keywords? Lessons, right? And bitter experiences. So you have to emphasize that history is the best teacher out there, right? Experiences, we have talked about Frederick Nietzsche. So Frederick Nietzsche can be paraphrased here as well, that he talked about that our all the actions and all the decisions are dependent and based upon our past lived experience. So that is what you can talk about. So history is the best teacher. Now, where do you get these experiences from? Experiences can be lived, personal, can be shared knowledge, civilizational values. All of them count for experience, isn't it? If, let's suppose, you read a book. Now, you read a book and you see that, okay, let's suppose you read about Mahatma Gandhi, and you see that Mahatma Gandhi basically suffered certain racial discrimination. Now, that gives you an idea as well. You learn a lesson that earlier this used to happen. So it can be from the shared knowledge, civilizational values as well. And what are lessons? What do we mean by lessons? Lessons are associated with improvement over the present phase. Whatever your present conditions are, how do you improve over them? And how do they end up yielding a better result? Only then it is a lesson. Otherwise, it is not a lesson. You have learned something from a past experience, but again, you are suffering from the same kind of experience, means what? It was not a lesson learned, right? There was no lesson learned. So, lesson, whenever the term lesson is used, means what? There is a scope of improvement. Okay, so that also needs to be elaborated. What do we mean by experiences? What do we mean by lessons? Ideally, in different paragraphs. And then the perspectives can be provided. Now, history is the strictest teacher. History here refers to what? Our experience. Now, here you can provide the story of Babur as the anecdotal evidence. Now, I hope we are aware, and all of us would be aware about the fact that Babur, when it came to victory over the Uzbeks and Shebani Khan, now at that point of time, Babur basically, when he immediately became the king, at that point of time, he did not have the experience of how the Uzbeks behave. It was only later on when he learned their art, when he learned about their guys, that is when he basically started to ensure that there are other ways to gain victory. Finally, he managed to gain victory over the region of Samarkand. It was brief, but it was based upon his previous defeats, his previous humiliations that he had suffered. And Babur himself notes that had he not suffered those kind of humiliations, probably he would have died a painful death. Right? So that is where the story of Babur can be used as an anecdotal evidence in that case. Ashoka's dilemma post the Kaling War, where he himself firsthand experienced the killing of the masses. So, as I told you in the initial part itself, for almost all the topics, Buddhism, idea of Ashoka's Dhamma, Gandhiji's endeavor and fight against independence, Nelson Mandela, then you can take the case of the present day activists. These will be some of the anecdotes, even Jataka stories. These will be some of the anecdotes that you can freely use in multiple different avenues. Okay, so please ensure all the candidates who are going to appear for the next time, you are very well versed with their life stories. That can be very vital to provide a hefty kind of introduction. Okay, now India's freedom struggle. Now, it is not as if 1947 was the first time that we launched the struggle for independence. The first war of Indian independence was in 1857. Now, we had learnings from that, isn't it? We had learnings which was gained from the failure of the non-cooperation movement as well. We had learnings from the civil disobedience movement as well. We had learnings that we gained even from the Quit India movement. Now, that ensured that our strategy for gaining independence was complete and was multidimensional. So, that is where learnings through losses ensured India's independence. Gandhiji's idea of unity, he had seen that through his experience in South Africa itself, that basically a country can never, ever, or any justice cannot be won on the back of disunited society or fragmented society. So that is why Mahatma Gandhi became one of the first leaders who could ensure mass agitation, including women. You had mass agitations during the Swadeshi movement as well, around 1905. Then also you had a mass agitation. But the rate of women participation during non-cooperation movement was simply something that the Britishers had never experienced. So that was something which Mahatma Gandhi had understood. That a struggle can never sustain endlessly. That is where Mahatma Gandhi's entire idea was struggle, unification of the society, struggle against again unification of the society, and again struggle. So that ensured that we had a relentless attack against the Britishers. Then, rise of Europe post the Second World War. Now, Europe, when you read about the killings in the First World War, the killings in the Second World War, you had hundreds and thousands and lakhs of people dying in a month. But then Europe learned an important lesson. And today, Europe is more united in terms of trade, in terms of people to people contact. And that is why it is reaching new heights of prosperity. Leo Tolstoy had famously said, those who have not seen the era of war can never appreciate the era or the importance of peace. So, this also highlights or substantiates this particular argument or the quotation that those who have never witnessed war will never appreciate peace. So, it is the bitter experience of the war which makes you value peace more than ever. Something that you can take a look into it whenever a skirmish between, let's suppose, India and Pakistan breaks out, a war between India and Pakistan breaks out. Look at the plight of the people living in the bordering areas. The people in the bordering areas, they are worried whether they will be able to look at the next sunrise or not. But the people in the hinterland, the people far away from the border, they keep on beating the war drums. And even today, you have large amount of disenchantment regarding why was there a ceasefire. The people people in Punch who died, people in Araspura who died. Now, those lives are not coming back. So that is a bitter experience. So the people in the bordering areas, they have learned through bitter experience. They will never advocate war. So that is the learning. Then framing of the constitution, idea of secularism and socialism is also debated and has been written vociferously in various op-eds and various debates in the recent times. We have marked 50 years since the imposition of emergency. So, as a consequence of that, there have been debates in various circles that do we really need the idea of secularism and socialism in our preamble? Now, what was our learning during the freedom struggle? That as a society, when we were divided, we basically Okay, welcome back, everyone. Apologies for the slight interruption. Owing to technical glitches, there was an interruption. Now, quickly coming back to the topic that we were discussing. We were talking about the past experiences, and that is, we were talking about the ideas of secularism and socialism as well. So basically, as we have said, that there was a lot of debate about, and has been a debate in the recent times, whether that socialism and the idea of secularism should be removed from the preamble. But our learnings from the freedom movement have been what? That basically idea of socialism did prevent us against exploitation by the capitalist during a lot of a time, and also secularism that brought the society together and brought the communities together and aided our fight in terms of against exploitation against the Britishers. So that is why this is a lesson which has been learned from the bitter experiences of the past. Now, why bitter experiences do matter? Why is it that best lessons are learned only from bitter experiences. First of all, victory does provide a kind of a complacency. When you have easy victory coming your way, you tend to become complacent. You take things for granted. And this has seen the downfall of various empires. We can see the case of the downfall of the Mughals, to the case of the downfall associated even with the Romans, right? Where back to back victories made them complacent in a way, and that is what caused and created their downfall. Now, victory, and if you have had a fair experience, an easier experience, a luxurious experience, that also creates procrastination. You take, as we talked about, that not only do you take things for granted, you take things easy, you delay your task as well. So that again leads to future defeats. So that is why this can lead to future defeats. Okay, defeats in the future. Then after that, basically, you can have the vertical expansion of the topic, that lessons learned through experience or the family society. Now, if the family has gone through a bitter experience in the past, the next generation also learns from that. Be it the case of a social strife, a social clash, or be it even in the case of financial pragmatism. A family or a society which has gone through financial hardship, they ensure that they value savings much more. Now, this was a report done by IMF associated with the Chinese economy, where they talked about that China in general and even India considers saving as a virtue owing to the past deprivations that they have experienced. So that can also be brought to the table, helps avoid the mistakes of the past. Whatever were the mistakes done in the past, that is not repeated, and makes the future pathway easier as well. You can provide various perspectives of the bitter experiences and the learnings provided. Nazism and fascism, that has still remained one of the most vital lessons that humanity has learned in the past century, whereby the inclusive governance and the role of democracy has been highlighted since the Second World War. Authoritarian regimes, regardless of the propaganda machinery that they run, all of the authoritarian regimes, they have led to some deprivation somewhere or the other. So that is where these authoritarian regimes, what they do bring to the table, that has been a bitter experience, be it in Africa, be it in Asia, even in our neighborhood, that has created very bad experiences. And that is what even the Pol Pot regime in Cambodia can be cited. The Pol Pot regime in Cambodia, that can also be cited. Okay. Now, separatism and subnationalism also we have talked about that. As a country, we have had very bad experiences associated with separatism, subnationalism in various different parts of the country. So that is why you will find that now there is a greater learning learned, not only in the model of governance, but also in terms of the regional and the people of different regions as well, where these ideas are not propagated and promoted anymore. As a society, the learnings against discrimination have been vital. That is why even a tinge of discrimination in certain areas, that is punished, and the same goes for patriarchal values and patriarchal ideas as well. When we talk about the global governance models, now there might is right. That is a learning that we have learned. Not only India, but various other countries have learned that whosoever is powerful, they get their way in terms of the global order. And that is what has fueled global arms race. Global arms race. Okay. And that is something which has reached its crescendo and again is rising up. So that is why all the various countries, they want to arm themselves, but mostly when it comes to the learnings for India, we are increasingly focusing upon the idea of self reliance. When we talk about India China, we have seen that earlier China used to develop some of the regions and the villages in the bordering areas, and we would not be very suspicious. But then our learnings from 1962 have proven what? That whenever the Chinese tend to do some activities in the region of the border, it can have detrimental impact on India. That is why when even the Galwan clashes happen, after that, we have been much more careful. Right. So that is the learning in terms of the global governance. Economic aid to neighbors by India. We have talked about it. Vaccine diplomacy, because we also have experience through our experience or through our lived experience post independence that denial of medicines, vital life saving pills, and also food grains that basically ensured many people died. So that is why, and we suffered from famines in larger parts of the country, including Bengal. So that is why India has learned from it that humanity needs to be saved from this scourge. So that is why India resorts to vaccine diplomacy and the grain aid as well. Importance of multilateralism has been established owing to the learnings of the bloc politics in the Second World War. In terms of climate and economic learnings, so climate change, heat waves, and drought cycles have become a norm of the day. And that is why the learnings have been that conserve water. Across the world, you have the movement to save soil, save water, isn't it? You basically have all these movements which have been initiated. So that is basically owing to the learnings, the experiences, right? Disasters and its management. In 1999, Odisha cyclone, the loss of life was in terms of thousands, 10,000 and more people lost their lives in the Odisha cyclone in 1999. Now, that meant that we, in a way, not only did establish a disaster relief mechanism, but we ensured that the institution was so robust that it has been in a phase of self improvement ever since then. Now, we basically adopt a policy of zero casualties, that is based upon our own experience. Then, small island nations, when it comes to the flooding, Tuvalu is getting flooded, and it is estimated that Tuvalu can get completely drowned out in the next decade or so. So that is why when it comes to the fight against climate change, they basically bring perspectives from their own learnings, from their own experiences. That is why they are so vociferous in the global order for climate justice and climate change. Now, when it comes to economic aspect, what you can bring to the table is India being a mixed economy. Right. Now, what was our learning? Capitalism is not good, can lead to the concentration of wealth. Absolute communism can lead to destruction of the existent societies in many parts. It can lead to the flight of capital. Right. So we had learned the failings of capitalism, and the failings of communism as well. So, as a consequence, we adopted a midway path, that is the mixed economy, and that has yielded positive results. Departure from the license Raj. Earlier, when we had monopolistic practices in terms of the economic model, we had a very stymied or a limited growth. And that is where we basically had licenses given to big individuals, and crony capitalism became a norm. And that is where the need for reform was there. And in 1991, India went for substantial reforms. Even when we talk about the case of the various scams in the market, for example, the Harshad Mehta scam. Now, all of that indicated what? There was a greater or requirement of a greater amount of scrutiny. Even when we talk about the financial meltdown of 2008, now that called for the whereby various different banks they became insolvent overnight. That basically led for stricter regulation and stricter following of the Basel norms. Basel norms in economy you would have studied talks about the importance of maintaining your capital adequacy ratio is something which is very important for the various banks. India in itself had set up earlier the Narsimhan committee in order to ensure the revitalize or reinvigoration of the banks as well. And India overall, as we were left behind in the race for industrialization. That is why India has learnt its lesson. And when it comes to the space, when it comes to the development of AI or digital economy or the fourth industrial revolution, we want to be at the forefront. that basically frames our modern day policy measures. So again, learnings from bitter experience. Now, nothing can uh, substantiate this topic more than the aspect of sports. So when we talk about sports, the best learnings, for example, you take the most followed sport in India, that is cricket. Now, the best learnings that cricket has given to us as a team was when we suffered very vitiating defeats, isn't it? Very humiliating defeats, so to say. For example, you can give the example of the 2007 first World Cup win, the T20 World Cup win. That happened on the back of India eliminated from the group stage in the World Cup after a long period, or in fact, for the first time in that decade. And that was in 2007 itself. So 2007, India lost, and then it came back to regain the World Cup glory. So that is where sports analogy and metaphors can be used. You can use various sporting greats from Tiger Woods. You can use the case of Michael Jordan. You can use the case of Rafael Nadal. All these various individual sporting personalities. You can take the case of individual cricketers from Virat Kohli to Sachin Tendulkar. Any of the sporting personalities that you take a look into, their life has been an embodiment of learning from bitter experiences and self improvement thereby. So, that is something you can talk about. But the drawbacks of it, when you draw everything and every learning from your bitter experiences and from your past experiences, you are limiting yourself in the thought process in a particular box. You are not allowing yourself to think beyond a certain proportion. So that is why there is a limited outlook to the issues which are talked about, or the problem solving ability. It is very limited. There's a lack of newer ideas. And what we observe in our case, due to our colonial legacy and due to the deprivations and the oppression that we have suffered at the colonial hands, we are always wary of capitalism. That is why even today, Economic Survey uses the term stigmatization of capital. So that basically talks about that our we don't prefer the capital creation in our country as a society. We look at the capitalist with a suspicious eye. Earlier, the narrative used to be that the Tatas and the Birlas would be corrupt. Now it is that the Adanis and the Ambanis are corrupt. So that is the normative case where we take a look at a capitalist and we eye them with suspicion. That is not good for wealth creation in any particular society. So that is again a drawback of our bitter experiences of the past. We have experienced that in the past. That is why the same thought process goes ahead. In many of the cases, the bitter experiences of the past does not allow the society to bridge the past divides. For example, if you take the case of US and USSR, or US and Russia in the present context. Now, regardless of how many peace deals happen, regardless of how many dialogues happen, there always will be a suspicious eye towards each other owing to the experiences in the past. Regardless of howsoever confidence building measures happen and take place between India and China, there will always be an eye of suspicion with each other. Same with the case of India and Pakistan. So that is where peace gets limited opportunity in these areas. So that is where the social divides deepen. It can lead to resentment. For example, take the case of Pakistan. The only case of growing resentment against India is owing to the bitter experience that they have suffered whenever they have waged a war against India. So that is where it can lead to resentment. And it can be easy to spread misinformation and divide the society in the modern era based upon someone else's bitter experience. That look, earlier also you had suffered on the hands of these people. Today also the same thing will happen. The otherization and the exclusionary practices in the society, they become very common. Okay, I hope this is clear. Right. Now coming to some of the or the four essays and the topics in section B. Now, muddy water is best cleared by leaving it alone. Now, before coming to it, out of the four questions that we have discussed, which is the topic that you would have written an essay on? Let me know that in the comment section below. Which of the topic you found it comparatively easier of the four topics that we have discussed till now? Mind you, while you are writing an essay for the topic, you have to keep in mind what you would write for 1200 words, not the immediate 200 or the 300 words. So muddy water is best cleared by leaving it alone. Now, you decipher the meaning of this, you explain the meaning of this. What are the keywords and the key phrases here? Muddy water, right? And leaving it alone means what? Muddy water means what? Chaos, right? Turbulence. That is what is meant by muddy water. But in general, what is the literal meaning? For example, in a particular river or in a sea, when the water has been muddied by certain activities, leave it for some time, automatically the dirt will settle down and the clear picture will emerge. So, emergence of clear picture post the era of chaos and turbulence. That is the key thread that you have to go ahead with. So, what is inferred by muddy water? So, ideas, confusion, too many ideas floating around at the same time, information overflow, that can lead to misguided decision making as well. Economic turbulence can happen in terms of the societies, in terms of the countries, social chaos in terms of the divide and the various different cracks that appear in the social structure. Now, what do we mean by leaving it alone? The power of patience. When you have patience and when you appreciate patience as a virtue, that gives you the importance of time as well, right? We say time is the best healer. So that is where the time has got a virtue associated. Now, over a period of time, as you leave it alone, you gather more evidence regarding what is the ground situation. And then you can create or get a better decision. And then it can lead to better and saner decisions. The best case in point here you can prove in the present day context is what is happening between India and US, isn't it? Now, India and US, now US, particularly led by the president, almost through the social media posts, have been declaring from the top of the rooftops that this is happening, this is wrong with India, that is wrong with India. Now, what has been the stand of Indian diplomacy? Let the muddy waters settle down. Let the chaos settle down. This is a civilizational state which has survived for 5,000 years. We will do it again. And we will survive all this. So rather than stooping to their levels and muddying yourself, let the dirt settle down. Let clarity emerge that we are not the biggest importers. We are not fueling the war anywhere. We have a right to protect ourselves. So that is the case of leaving it alone, not touching it. Right? So, anecdotes. Buddha was in a state of chaos when it came to basically when he was a prince and he had all the luxuries in life, he was in a state of chaos. But then eventually, when he went through meditation and he basically sought enlightenment, peace, that is when all the various different chaotic ideas that settled down and he could gain enlightenment, right? Or Gandhiji's journey through India, right? When Gandhiji came to India, now at that point of time, he was mentored by Gokhale. Now, when Gandhiji did come to India in the second decade of 1900s, there were so many different convergent views within the Congress itself. There were different ideas about what should be done as the next measure against the British. What did Gandhiji do? Did he immediately get swayed by the extremists or the moderates who were still, in a way, divided even around 1915? No. He took a journey across India. He let his turbulent ideas in terms of the various different thought processes coming through his mind, he basically let it settle down. That is when he understood the problem of the masses. And that is where his fight could be long lasting, going and stretching for decades. Now, another best anecdote that you can provide, very good anecdote for this can be slightly out of the box, is the post apartheid South Africa in the era of Nelson Mandela. Now, Nelson Mandela, when he was released from prison after almost 27 years, and South Africa basically was in a mood of taking revenge. Many of the indigenous population was in the mood of revenge against the Europeans, against the whites. The country could have easily fallen into the trap of civil war, something that the rest of the African countries they do witness on a regular basis. What did Mandela do? He allowed everything to calm down. He took a saner decision that the society has to be bound together. So there were multiple different petitions, litigations, all the applications that went to him that remove all the Europeans and the whites from your government, from your entire staff. Mandela didn't heed to them. He allowed all the ideas to come to and then took his own decision. And that ensured that South Africa becomes one of the beacons in the southern part of otherwise disturbed continent. So that is again an interesting anecdote that you can provide to the table. Now, decision making can and should be done when you have clarity in mind, when you have weighed all the possible options, and mind you, when it comes to governance and even at a personal level, those emotions calm down and then take an informed decision. So that can be of great value in public life. So that is where you can talk about the mental calmness, the aspect of emotional semblance, okay, and emotional peace, okay. Then in the modern era, this aspect of muddy waters is applicable in creating a lot of mental health issues as well. So those mental health issues can be debilitating. Now, this is driven by modern social narratives that you have in, and social media plays a substantial role into it. This can also create a social disorder. Now, when you have social disorder, when let's suppose two factions of the society are fighting with each other, do you immediately attain peace or long lasting peace? No. At that point of time, negotiations can never be very fruitful. It can only seek temporary peace. In order to seek long lasting peace, you allow the tempers to settle down. When the tempers on both sides have settled down, then they will reach the negotiating table in a much more saner manner. Okay? Social reform. Social reform can happen during the era of peace and not during a churn. Now, the political perspectives. Now, oftentimes in the government governance and in terms of decision making, even as let's suppose an administrative official, there are multiple narratives, counter narratives, public sentiment, etc., which keeps on floating around. Buckling to the public sentiments can oftentimes prove to be a wrong decision. That is something that our past experience has taught us, that you should not take a decision as a government under a popular public perception. So that is where public sentiments succumbing to it can be detrimental. You can provide various different cases where mass protests have led to the passage of a legislation in haste, but that has virtually not been very helpful. Here you can take the case of the Lokpal and the Lokayukta as well. There was mass protest and mass agitations, but it has not been a very fruitful decision out there, right? And even when we talk about, let's suppose, the farm bills. Now, farm bills, they some of them were beneficial. There was a problem in terms of how they were brought, but the narratives and the counter narratives, the muddy waters which were there, that was not the time to bring and impose those farm bills. Let everything settle down, let everybody be satisfied that their interests are at the key point of focus, and then you bring about reforms. Okay. Now, governance is to strike a balance. That is where, when you have multiple different agendas pulling in different directions, Gandhiji's talisman to remember the last individual and to weigh whether the decision on the governance parameter it will benefit the last individual or not, that has to be the yardstick, and that should be the yardstick for policy making. Now, this is something which has also been observed in terms of judicial decisions, which sometimes can be driven by media reports. Media reports can get carried away. And sometimes the judiciary has also observed this and made observations that that can be misleading in terms of arriving at a particular judgment. So, this is the aspect of political perspective. Now, international diplomacy, we have also talked about US and India relations. They are going through a turbulent phase right now. But right now, Many of the people, for example, they talk about the case that because Donald Trump has spoken, Prime Minister Modi should also retaliate back with the same voice. But then Indian diplomacy so far has been very well measured, let the dirt settle down, and then India can take the measure that it wants to. That is what China is also following, by the way, as a policy measure. When it comes to Indo-China relationship, now there, these are civilizational nations. There can be many arguments, narratives, counter narratives developed regarding how India wants to threaten China and vice versa. But eventually, both of them will have to coexist, right? So that is the case of the modern or the present day SEO meetings which are happening. Resolution of conflicts can be done once the tempers flare down. Here you can take the case of Russia Ukraine, that now they are on the negotiating table, that the tempers have flared down. In terms of environmental aspect, leave the nature alone and nature can take care of itself. That is the lesson that we learned during the COVID times. Okay, that the species, they started reclaiming the regions very quickly once the lockdown was imposed across the globe, right? So the best way for natural rejuvenation has been or is to leave it alone. Let everything settle down. Economy during the 2008 financial crisis. Now, that is where, again, you had a lot of turbulence, lot of various different weak points which are being exposed. At that point of time, imposing a reform would have been worthless. So that is why, even during that point of time, if you take a look at our own budgetary policies, some of those budgetary decisions have haunted us in terms of the NPA crisis, which carried on to the next decade. So that is why, once the dirt settles down, then take the economic decisions to come away out of it. Even when you talk about the time of financial crisis in, let's suppose, investment markets, when it is chaotic, better to stay away. Now, what can be the counter perspective for the muddy waters topic? When we talk about the best development in art, music, theater, various different performing or architectural art forms, some of the best works have happened during the era of chaos, the era of conflict, because that can express various different types of thought pointers coming together. For example, when you talk about the French art and the development of the French School of Art during the French Revolution, it has been massive. You take a look at the development of philosophical ideas, the poets, etc., during the French Revolution, it has been massive. When we take a look at the development of the literary works in our own country during the pre independence era, the work has been substantial. When we talk about, let's suppose, even social reform oftentimes is invigorated based on what? The era of chaos, that we cannot have it anymore, right? Now, there are multiple things, for example, even in the case of climate action, where there is an urgent need for a curative action. You cannot allow the climate to settle down before taking an action. You have to take it today. So that is why call for urgent actions, even in the case of the area of conflict, you can talk about it. Okay? So I hope that brings all the perspectives to the table. The next question. The years teach much which the days never know. This is about experience again. Now, the longer experiences that you have, right, oftentimes the individual days are forgotten, but the longer experiences and the lessons, they are imbibed, they are inherited. So the years teach much which the days never know. So here, importance of experience, learnings from each failure that we have discussed earlier, short-term experiences for long-term lessons which are required, and we are living in an era of gratification, consumerism, materialism. So that is where, again, we have to have a foresight for the years rather than focusing upon the individual days that pass. Then, materialism versus spiritualism or consumerism, and the various perspectives that we will add. So, what are the anecdotes that can be added? So, for example, here you can talk about that presently we all enjoy freedom. We have celebrated the Independence Day recently. But then endless small sacrifices, not small or large, but the nameless sacrifices. The individuals who lost their lives in various struggles, from non cooperation to civil disobedience to Quit India movement. We know the name of the leaders. We know and identify the revolutionaries by Bhagat Singh, Roshan Lal, all of them, Chandrasekhar Azad. But there were many people who lost their lives along with them. Those are the nameless. So that is where the nameless, they are easily forgotten. The years are remembered, right? Even when we talk about India's contribution in Second World War, hundreds and thousands of people lost their lives. Few of them are basically retained in the popular memory. So that can be the case. Then you can take the case of life of a sports person or a celebrity. That today, when you see a Roger Federer, or today, when you see, let's suppose, a Lewis Hamilton, you think about the kind of excellence that they have reached, or a Virat Kohli for that matter. You talk about the excellence and the pivotal moment in life that they have been able to reach. But then the days that they have struggled endlessly, continuously, that success of, or that story of success does involve equal number of stories of struggle. So those days are forgotten, but the larger years are retained. So that also you can explain in the form of story. Rise of a nation state can be talked about. Kailash Satyarthi or other social workers. Now, Kailash Satyarthi, one of the social workers who received the prize, now he basically, for a long period of time, for every day for years together, has been working for removing the scourge of child labor in our country, right? All those days are not remembered. When is that remembered? When the person gets rewarded, right? So every day is forgotten, the years are retained, the learnings are retained. The Bishnoi community and their basic principle for conservation of environment, right? Now, this has been a long standing principle for decades, centuries now. So that is where this principle, followed on a day to day basis, can easily be taken lightly. In terms of the governance, now we all talk about and debate that constitution should have this, constitution does not have this, constitution requires amendment, and so on. But we forget the endless debates that were done during the framing of the constitution, right? So that is where the churn, which basically was there during the framing of the constitution, that was the day to day occurrence. That is forgotten. So, learnings through each day is important, even in terms of governance and policy making. And when you carry out long term reforms, for example, we talk about the success or the failures of Green Revolution, but the idea of implementing the Green Revolution, ensuring when MS Swaminathan introduced Green Revolution or wanted to introduce Green Revolution, the hurdles or the setbacks he faced from the bureaucracy, that is forgotten, right? But the learnings are retained. Healthcare, education, midday meal schemes, these are where long term reforms have been carried out by taking a look at and ensuring that every small dot is ticked. So that is required. Okay. Achievement of sustainable development goals. You need to have long term perspectives in order to ensure meaningful governance as well. And that is the same thing in terms of scientific research. The famous anecdotal story can also be talked about when we talk about Edison and his discovery of a bulb, the invention of a bulb. Now, Edison is famously said to have failed almost 999 times or 1,000 times before inventing a bulb. Now, that failure, what did Edison say about it? He said that I just found out 1,000 ways how not to build a bulb. And that is how I found the correct way. So, scientific research there and the scientific successes come on the back of lot of various different setbacks, right? So that scientific research and outcome, fight against climate change, is not something which will happen in 2050 or at the end of 2025 or at the end of 2026. Fight against climate change has to happen today, tomorrow, and has to continue. Even when we talk about Chipko movement, now Chipko movement ensured that the wide scale deforestation which was carried out, that was stopped at an individual tree level. This is where you can basically use the case of the Supreme Court judgment against the deforestation case as well, that every single tree is valuable. Then only you can conserve the forest. You cannot conserve the forest holistically by allowing some of the trees to be cut off. Okay, so that is where the Supreme Court judgment can also be kept in mind. The role of mentors, the coaches, so how every day they also go through the struggle in order to train their pupils. That is also important. Conflict resolution is a slow and steady process. Conflict will be resolved after many years. Many of the conflicts are resolved after decades altogether. That is after day-to-day negotiations which happen. Then building a nation, hard and soft power. Now, today, everybody is talking about the rise of China, but China has been working relentlessly in this since 1970s. So that is something which people don't appreciate. People feel that China has basically risen almost 5 years back or 7 years back. That is not the case. So that is where it takes a long period of endless endeavor and efforts to grow as a nation state. And that is the same case for development and maturity as an individual also, that you need to work upon yourself on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, and seek the goal of self improvement. Then peaceful society and community, when we talk about, so one has to work for the peace. Okay, so that peace is achieved with a lot of difficulty. Okay, now coming to the next question. It is best to see life as a journey and not as a destination. So this has been reframed. It had been asked earlier in the previous years of essay as well, where it is about importance of the journey rather than importance of a destination. Now, here also you have the provision or the scope to provide a counter narrative or a counter perspective. But first of all, aligning with the aspect of the topic. So, what is the aspect or the direction of the topic? That when you talk about life, it is not about attaining salvation. It is not about an afterlife. It is not about attaining peace when you are 60 or 70 or 80. It is about being peaceful today. It is about being happy today. So, again, this is a debate about consumerism versus the case of spiritualism or minimalism, rather. So, minimalism versus consumerism or materialism. Okay. So, importance of the journey. What is that journey through life? Self learning. That throughout this journey, self learning becomes important. Only then will you value this journey, as long as you keep on learning something on a daily basis. Illusion of a destination. What is a destination? 60 years, I'll be happy. When you reach 60, 80 years, I'll be happier. When you reach 80, I will be happier at 85. Right? So it is an illusion. And when do you actually become happy? You sacrifice. That is where the importance of work life balance also comes into place. Family values, work life balance, that once I will work significantly, eventually I will lead a good life. There might not be a future tomorrow, right? So that is where you have to live each day as if it is your last and learn as if you were to live forever. Who provided this quote? This was provided by Mahatma Gandhi. So that quote can also be provided here. Okay. Materialism or an instant gratification. This can also be cited as consumerism versus minimalism. Okay. Right. That consumerism, when you are chasing a destination, you are basically very consumerist in your idea. But then minimalism is about being content. So that can be applied in other articles, other topics as well, here as well. Means is as important as the end goal. This was Gandhian idea. There was the prominent thought that end justifies the means. Whatever means you are taking, end justifies the means. But Gandhian ideas were that no, means are equally as important. You cannot take an unjustifiable means to reach a destination. That can be used in order to bring the perspective of modern day atrocities like terrorism, etc. They are all seeking to reach a destination, but they are forgetting that the life that they are leading is basically wrong and unjust. Then the anecdote that you can provide is about how you live each day to the fullest, and that anecdote can be talked about in Charvak principles, Indian philosophy, Indian school of thought. Charvak principles, they talk about what? That live each day and in order to make yourself happy. That's it. There is no such afterlife. There is no such happiness or salvation at the end. This is the life that you have to be happy about. So that is how you can talk about Charvak principles in a way of anecdote. So that will be a good departure from the general norm. Illusion of chasing a dream. What are we chasing? Happiness, peace, spirituality. What are we chasing? That is an illusion. That is a mirage which keeps on going further and further away. Then chasing historical greatness oftentimes does happen in terms of the society and the nation states, that we were great once and we will be great again. While it does provide some meaning in certain cases, but oftentimes it seeks to revive the older ideas, which is never good. And various different countries who have adopted this, they have never had a good end or a good destination. Then governance goals, the each and everyday measure, sustainable development, right? Distant future versus immediate needs. There needs to be a balance which needs to be struck. When we talk about defense requirements at the bordering regions, now there we have a long term need, a destination that India is self secure, but we have immediate needs as well. One rank, one pension. The soldiers need to be happier. The soldier needs to be better equipped. The soldier needs to have bulletproof vest. So before, or we can work for the jets, but we need to work for the soldier as well. Then balance in life is important to be achieved. Wellness versus medicines, one has to also go for wellness on a day to day basis. One has to enjoy life, and that is by better standards of and sustainable aspects of living. And this can also be brought to the table in form of economic parameter, that is GDP versus the HDI. Rather than chasing the growth numbers, we have to ensure, is every individual included in the developmental path or the growth path or not. So that is the economic perspective. Learnings versus chasing of mere degrees. So this is one of the lacunae of our modern day education system, where we seek degrees, that at the end of this course, I will get that degree. Whether we are learning anything in that or not, that is far away. So as a consequence, what happens? This leads to rise in unemployment, right? Lower employability. Okay. Now, development of sustainable solutions when it comes to scientific learnings, and even when we talk about climate and the planet for tomorrow. If you want to have a good planet in 2100, you need to work for a good planet today as well. So that thought you can talk about. Now, importance of giving value to a destination rather than on a day-to-day occurrence. Why is it that destination needs to be valued? Because in many of the cases it provides a purpose, it provides a peace in individual self, that today I'm going through hardship for a longer term agenda. Today, if you carry out reform for a longer term goal, right? So that just basically ensures that you are able to live through the harder times. So that is where the destination, the long term goals, they sometimes are justifiable. Even in the development of the nation, when you carry out the reforms, there is a short term pain for the long term gain. So there you can use the term no pain, no gain, right? Unless and until. So, just following the Charvak principle, if you are a UPSC aspirant, that today I will live my day as if it is my last and I will have all the enjoyment in the world, you will never fulfill your dream of clearing the civil services, right? So, you have to sacrifice your today for the longer term goal. So, in many of the cases, that longer term goal becomes a driving factor. Yes, it is in this context that you can also talk about the Viksit Bharat 2047. Bharat 2047. Okay. importance of long-term goals. Right? Now, coming to the last question. Contentment is natural wealth. Luxury is artificial poverty. Very simple, straightforward, but at the same time, a good topic to write about it. Contentment is natural wealth means what? If an individual, if a nation is content within itself, then the nation or the individual is much happier, right? It is like wealth. Whereas when you have luxury, excessive of something, then you will always feel the greed to have more. So UPSC had asked a question previously that need brings greed, and if greed increases, it destroys the breed. So this question is basically having the same connotations as per that PYQ as well. So here, what is contentment? Contentment at the self, contentment at the level of the society, contentment at the national level. For example, as a country, we have never been aggressors. We have never sought to occupy others' territory. Why? We are content in ourselves. We are happy with the territory that we have. We are happy with the people that we have. We are happy with the resources that we have. Isn't it? But then take a look at the other country, our Western neighbor. It is not content, it is about expansion. So that is where it is a natural wealth for us. And for them, it is a poverty. So that can be talked about. What do we mean by luxury? Abundance of options, abundance of choices. Okay, so this is the aspect of need brings greed. If greed increases, it destroys the breed. Anecdote: Buddha's turn in terms of the change that he brought about in his life. What is the change? Again, the same thing. When he went for enlightenment, and prior to that, despite having everything, he was very dissatisfied. When he renounced everything, he was in a happier state. Isn't it? That is the argument for minimalism. Downfall in the midst of luxury. We have talked about it. Romans, Mughals, Byzantines, even Ottomans at the time of luxury that ensured their downfall. That can be endless number of examples. Mahatma Gandhi had famously said, there is a sufficiency in the world for man's need, but not for man's greed. Luxury breeds greed, brings about greed in the individuals, in the society as well. It starts from the basic requirement: I need food, I need better food, I need the best quality food, I need movement, I need the best vehicles for movement. So the greed increases. When there is more greed, that brings about dissatisfaction. And that dissatisfaction can give rise to conflict within oneself, conflict in the society, concentration of wealth, inequalities developing. All of that can be an outcome of this. Okay, so that is something that you can talk about. That is why it is important to seek inner peace and inner satisfaction, which can be sought only after you are content with what you have. So, personal satisfaction, you can talk about Ashoka's journey as well. Now, cohesion in the society is brought about when? When you have everyone who is content. Everyone is content. Okay. With what they have. They are not looking at what others have. You are happy with what you have. Only then the society can be cohesive, a workplace can be conducive if contentment is provided. Then role of consumerism brings about instant luxury, but then again it fuels further hunger for acquiring more. So that is again a dangerous aspect. Now, this is where when we talk about nature, so living and being one with nature, that is the absolute wealth that one can have. Nature provides you with everything. Whereas if you destroy nature to create the bungalows out there to have a luxurious life, that can bring about abject poverty eventually. So these are the various perspectives that can be brought to the table, right? Now, you can also provide some counter narrative, even though the scope is not there in this topic. But if you want, you can talk about luxury and abundance of choices, also sometimes provide the peace of mind. And that peace of mind ensures that many of the times scientific decisions are taken. For example, you can take the case of Alex von Humboldt. Alex von Humboldt was born in the background of luxury. He was very wealthy. But then he managed to create some of the best of the researchers, scientific researchers out there. When you even talk about the later years of Michelangelo, he was a person who was content, but at the same time had luxury. So, luxury does not mean that you don't have contentment. So, that is something you can argue in the final portions as well. So that brings us to the end of the discussion of all the 8 topics. I hope you have understood what needs to be written. Do let me know which is the essay topic that you would have written for the section B as well, and as well as section A. I hope this has been helpful. If you have liked the perspectives and the portion content provided, do put that in the comment section, and don't forget to click on the like, share, and the subscribe button. Till we meet again tomorrow, take care. Goodbye. Thank you.